I want to thank Rishi for the introduction, and I want to thank you for thinking it important enough to spend some of your time being part of the conversation. I want to pick up on something that Rishi began with, and that is the value that I place on research. I think I like to pride myself on a person who is multi-dimensional in the sense that I can find time to do the administrative part of my responsibilities. But for me, just as important as the administrative is the scholarly. And so I try to keep the two dimensions of my being going. What I'll spend a few minutes having a conversation with you about comes out of a presentation I did in Santo Domingo a couple of months ago on penal reform. For the last couple of years, the second year in Santo Domingo, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation has organized a conference for Central America, Caribbean, and a few South American countries, looking at the issue of organized crime, the issue of human trafficking, the issue of drug trafficking. And this year they asked me to lead the conversation about penal reform. And so this started as a simple conversation about penal reform in the Caribbean context. But I was supposed to go to beautiful island of St. Lucia, just as beautiful as Dominican Republic, a few weeks ago to talk about penal reform and crime. Those of us who were following the Hurricane Thomas path would know that Thomas did some devastation in St. Lucia and St. Vincent and Barbados. And so that conference has been postponed until January. And what I did, therefore, is to use the opportunity of the extension of the St. Lucia proposed conversation to update this, to put the issue of penal reform in the context of penal reform driven by the thing that drives the need for imprisonment. And that thing is crime. Now, the issue of penal reform became higher up on the agenda in law enforcement and security circles in the Caribbean because this year in particular, there have been a number of dramatic prison breaks in the Caribbean. Those of us who follow the region intimately. Here, I have a picture of a prison called the Bordelais prison in a place called Dennery, eastern St. Lucia. You had within 2 weeks in Dennery, 2 prison breaks. The first prison break, they haven't found the guys. A couple of Venezuelans and one St. Lucian. The Venezuelans part of an international drug trafficking ring. But not only has the Bordelais prison precipitated the issue of penal reform and the nature of how we manage prisons in the Caribbean to a kind of a high agenda item, even before Bordelais, there had been several very dramatic instances, particularly in Jamaican contexts, of riots in prisons. And when you put the backdrop about prison riots in Venezuela, prison riots in Brazil, prison riots in Panama, you can well understand why the issue of we have to do something about prisons by way of reforming what happens with prison management, why that issue would rise to an issue of importance, not only for the security sector, but for, as you'll see in a few minutes, other sectors as well. Interestingly, though, if you propose to examine the issue of prison reform, it's necessary to go beyond the conversation about prisons. Because prisons themselves are only one part of the criminal justice architecture. And so prisons don't exist in and of and by themselves. They are connected to a larger architecture in the criminal justice system. And that is true whether you're talking about Costa Rica, or Brazil, or the United States, or Dominica. And so my proposition is that as we talk about prison reform in the Caribbean context, it's going to be necessary to extend the perimeter of the conversation beyond prisons, because prisons do not exist in isolation. A friend of mine at Harvard, Jorge Dominguez, one of the leading scholars in Latin America and the Caribbean, pulled together a bunch of us about a little more than a decade ago for a project. Jorge was at the time the head of the Weatherhead Center at Harvard. And he pulled several of us, about 19 of us together, to do a project examining the security situation in the region, so it's Caribbean and Central America. That project led to a book called From Pirates to Drug Lords. It doesn't focus on prison or prison reform, but I found that something that Jorge said in that book, in his introductory chapter, for me provides an interesting, perhaps epigraph to frame the conversation that I'd like to have with you today. And what he simply said there is, as you can see, the most common sources of insecurity in the Caribbean, and one can say Central America, South America, United States, the most common sources of insecurity affect the quotidian, meaning customary, daily experiences of ordinary people. Security has to do with ordinary people. Now, I've said to Jorge that while I like that proposition, I think the proposition also resonates with the sources of the insecurity. The sources of the insecurity have to do with ordinary people's lives being affected. But that code, I think, also resonates with the responses. How you deal with the security issues, how you deal with the challenges, also affect the quotidian experiences of ordinary people. The reality is that those responses are not single-dimensional. To do something about organized crime or drug trafficking or human trafficking, you've got to employ some economic responses. You've got to employ some military responses. You've got to apply some law enforcement responses. Now, when you think of the law enforcement responses, and the law enforcement comes uppermost in the minds when you think of prisons, when you think of the allied elements of the criminal justice architecture related to courts and police, the law enforcement comes foremost to mind, and very often the discussion on law enforcement tends to revolve around what I call the front end. What's the police doing? The front end, what's the army doing? The front end, what's the police and the army doing together, as have been the case in Dominican Republic, as has been the case in Jamaica, joint police army operations to deal with the problems posed to those societies. And so the tendency very often is to so focus on the front end that often there is relative neglect to the throughput and the tail end. The throughput and the tail end have to do with the courts. The tail end has to do with the prisons. And so my argument is, and I'm going to write this up into an article, my argument is, if you ask the question about the responses to these quotidian experiences, and you focus only on the law enforcement in the sense of the front end, police, army, joint operations, you're doing only a partial response. You've got to address what's happening in the courts, because there's a domino effect between arresting people and processing them through the courts. You've got to ask and do something about the tail end, what happens in the prisons. And I would argue that the crises that we're finding in the middle section and the tail end, the prisons at the tail end, and the courts and other parts in the middle section, those crises are precisely because they have been neglected. What happens in the courts has been relatively neglected. What happens in the prisons has been relatively neglected, because it's the front end where the citizens want to see action. They want to see the police doing something. They want to see the army doing something. And only secondarily, tertiarily, people are saying, well, we need to worry about the courts and overcrowded courts. We need to worry about the courts in dockets that are taking 10, 15 years to go through the entire system from arraignment to appeals to ultimate appeals, and we can come back to talk about some of that later on. And so the issue of prisons and the issue of prison reform has risen to the fairly top of the agenda for a variety of reasons, having to do dramatically with this year's incidents in parts of the region. I suggest that any conversation about prison reform needs to ponder at least two questions. To have an appropriate conversation about prison reform, one needs to pose the question, why is reform necessary? Why are we doing something? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Why is reform necessary? But I think it's important to go beyond the question of why is the reform necessary to us, and here is where the rubber hits the road question, what is entailed? What does reform really mean? What does it require? And so I'm going to recommend to you that we spend a few minutes talking a little bit about why reform, and we spend a little time talking about what it entails. Now, this is not to suggest that these are the only two questions one can pose. But it is also important to suggest, and I offer them in the context of caveats, we are not going to necessarily have enough time to examine the various dimensions of either question. What we might do is examine very cursorily, and if time permits and questions are there, we can deal with some of those questions. We are not going to be able to address all the questions or even all the elements of the questions 1 and 2. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that while we're focusing on prison reform, in the context of the criminal justice architecture, where the connection has to be between crime and punishment, it's important to keep in mind that punishment in the form of imprisonment is not the only form of punishment. There are other kinds of punishments in the panoply of the criminal justice system in any country, ranging from a fine to a suspended sentence to terms of imprisonment to all sorts of other permutations of imprisonment. So keep in mind that although we're focusing relatively strongly on imprisonment, imprisonment is not the only form of punishment. I know you know that, but sometimes repetition of emphasis is a good thing. So let's move quickly to the first question. Why is reform necessary in most places? Well, I think if you ask that question, at least 3 responses need to be part of the conversation. Reform is necessary in most places partly because there is a spiral in crime in places in the Caribbean. Not uniformly across the region, but significantly enough, and you'll see some of the evidence just now, that there is an impact on the middle section, the courts. There is an impact on the tail end, the prisons. And we'll talk a little bit about the crime. But it's important to keep in mind that as we talk about crime and crime spiral, the conversation needs to not be limited just to the volume of crime. How many murders, how many larcenies, how many burglaries, how many instances of domestic violence. What is interestingly and problematic for many Caribbean countries, particularly the Eastern Caribbean countries, is the nature of some of those crimes. The extensive use of weapons. And it's not only weapons used for drug operations. So we'll spend a minute or two making that observation. But then again, you come to the question of there's got to be a connection between the crime and the punishment. And we'll see that part of the impact on the overcrowded nature of prisons has to do with this interesting relationship in criminal justice that says there's got to be a correlation between the nature of the crime and the nature of the punishment. And we'll come to see in a few cases that the kinds of crime that have been perpetrated have been so driving policy about extending the imprisonment that the nature of the punishment is creating a domino impact on prison, precipitating the need for prison reform. And we'll come to see that overcrowded prisons is a reality of most Caribbean countries. Unsecure facilities is a reality of many Caribbean countries. So let's talk for a few minutes about the spiral in crime. A few years ago, the United Nations Development Program, along with the World Bank, commissioned a study looking at the Caribbean as a region and trying to understand in empirical terms. Let's pass this around, but I'd like to have it back. You know, books tend to walk sometimes, so you can have it back. Trying to ask the question, what is it that is happening in the Caribbean in regard to crimes? And I'll just share with you a couple of sentences from that report. Murder rates are higher than for any other region in the world and have risen in recent years for many of the region's countries. Assault rates are also significantly above average in the Caribbean. And I took the liberty of underlining this third sentence. These reported rates are highly sensitive to the level of trust in the local police in general and the willingness to report domestic violence in particular. What is being suggested here, and I think I would go beyond saying just suggested but asserted, is that notwithstanding the high volume of crime, some of it may be only part of what the reality is, because some of it may not be reported. And some of it may not be reported because people, citizens, don't have any confidence the police can do something about it. And so why bother to report it? I report it, they may arrest him, and then it takes 10 years to bring him to trial. They may bring him to trial and he has a right to appeal. It takes 15 years to get the appeal done. There is an impact in the societies, and it's true of the United States as well. If there is a low level of confidence by the citizens in the efficiency of the criminal justice system, that low level of confidence tends to make people underreport. What it also tends to make people do is engage in vigilante action. You come into my village and rape one of my girls, I'm going to your village and have somebody kill a couple. You look closely at many parts of Central America and the Caribbean, and it's not unique to that region, there is a lot of vigilantism, people taking the law into their own hands, partly because they don't have confidence that the police will do anything about it. They don't have confidence that the system is going to give them justice. And so part of the reality is what I call a reality where the Caribbean has the dubious distinction of having the world's highest per capita murder rate. It's not a comforting reality, but it's the reality just the same. I decided to capture just for a few countries the last few years, just one indicator of the spiral in crime, and that is the murder rates, reported homicides. It's been coming down in a few places, that's good, but problematic in that it has been sustained and in some cases increased in some places to the point where, and you take an example of that is St. Lucia, the political elites have not been able to make inroads in the crime situation, and so they ask the question indirectly, who has to suffer for this? And so they fired the police chief. Well, technically they didn't fire him, they reassigned him. They created a new office of special initiatives, and they say you'll have the same salary, but you're no longer in charge. Actually, he's suing them. Asked what Regis. He said, rightly, if you're going to remove me, why not the Minister of National Security? He's in charge of me. If you go to the Virgin Islands, you'll find the same thing last year. The police chief was removed because the governor said there is no confidence in you that you're making the crime go down. Now, the murders by numbers chart, like any statistical indicator or quantitative indicator, only tells part of the story. If you ask a couple of other questions, you'll get some other uncomfortable responses. One important question to ask, and students of criminal justice know this, is what is the resolution rate? of the murders. Okay, you have, let's say, Trinidad and Tobago, 544 murders in 2008. How many of those were resolved? In the sense that, did they catch the perpetrators? Did they bring them to justice? When you ask that question about resolution rate, you find that the answer is uncomfortably not very good. If you ask the question, well, these people who have been arresting these people, what is their level of efficiency and training? So that when they bring a charge, the charge would stand up in court, and there'll be some disposition of a penalty, whether the penalty is imprisonment or a fine. Sometimes there is a lot that's uncomfortable with the responses. And when you ask the question sometimes, how is the system designed to enable, once the gentleman is charged or the woman is charged, all the supporting evidence is there so that the judge can render a judgment that is fair, you sometimes have very uncomfortable answers. I remember a couple of years ago in Dominican Republic, huge bus, cocaine. Under the rules of evidence in Santo Domingo, and that is true of many other places, including the United States, there's got to be a certificate of test that says this substance is actually cocaine. Well, the very expensive lawyer that was hired from Miami, and I was in Florida at the time, realized that there were problems with the criminal justice system and that those machines to test the stuff were not working. So he said, Your Honor, the prosecution say it's cocaine, but I assert it's detergent. This is detergent. The judge asked for the certificate of test. Well, sir, señor, la máquina no está funcionando. Don't tell me the machine doesn't work. Show me what, under the rules of evidence, you have got to show as proof that what you assert is cocaine is actually cocaine. Case dismissed. There are so many instances where people go free on quote-unquote technicalities because the system as a whole doesn't get its act together. And so, while it is maybe useful to have these numbers, it is important to go beyond the numbers to probe other things, and you get a better sense of what the reality is. Now, let me go back to this for a minute. What is the country that stands out for you as having leader of the pack categorization in that list? Jamaica. 1,680 murders in 2009. Incredibly devastating to the image of Jamaica, incredibly problematic for the society as a whole. But the good news is that things have begun to change. For the first time since 2002 July, the monthly murder rate has begun to decline in Jamaica, dropping below 80. And it's cause for celebration. Not only has the number declined below a monthly rate of 80, but it has been sustained for 3 months. And that's a good news. I had a call from an Associated Press journalist in Puerto Rico, where the AP Bureau for the Caribbean is located, a couple of weeks ago. He said, Dr. G, help me understand, why is it, what explains this, what for him was an anomaly? Why are we seeing this good news in Jamaica? And so I'll share with you what I told that journalist from the Associated Press. I said to him that I think what we're seeing as the good news in Jamaica is connected with the experience Jamaica has had, the very untoward, negative experience this year of the dubious affair. I think there are several things about, and I'm not going to go into what the dubious affair, you can Google it if you haven't been following it, and get reams. Actually, it was taken to court again today, part of the trial. Dubious affair is an affair in which you had an organized drug trafficker who was supposed to be extradited to the United States. There are a number of connections politically and economically within Jamaica and the posse that Dubious held, to the point where the system was trying not to send him to the United States. System from the highest levels. It became politically untenable one certain bits of information was leaked out. And so the Prime Minister had to reverse himself and said, okay, let's find dubious and send him to the United States. Finding him was not as easy as they wanted. In finding him, there were 73 deaths. In finding him, there were $3 billion worth of damage to property. But that episode of the onslaught, and it was for a couple of days, physical battle between the dubious protectors in Tivoli Gardens and the police and the army. That for me was what I call kind of a shock therapy. What the police and the army did in responding to that call to find dubious, they used brute force. The brute force had not been used in that way by the law enforcement agencies in Jamaica before. And my proposition is that that brute force sent a message not only in Tivoli Gardens and in other garrisons, other strongholds of organized criminals. That brute force sent a message to the entire society. It, for me, amounted to a kind of a line in the sand on the part of the law enforcement vis-a-vis criminality. But it was a line in the sand that was accompanied by a significant amount of outrage in the society. The outrage was not only at the criminals. The outrage was against the police who were exercising brutality, brute force, but the outrage was also against the political elites who had been harboring for their own political interests the dubiouses of the world. And so the entire Jamaican society took on a climate of, we are not going to entertain criminality. And I think if you look at the statistics in Jamaica, you'll find that the decline is not only on reported homicides. I think I messed it up here. The decline has been in other categories of crime. Many of us who study the region, the law enforcement officials in Jamaica, and both the Commissioner of Police and the Army Chief are good friends of mine. Everyone is hoping that this positive indicator holds through and that the decline is sustained, the murder by numbers come down. But remember I said a minute ago, it's not simply the volume of crime that is worrying in the context of spiral. What also is troubling is that many Caribbean countries are seeing the kinds of crime you never saw in the region before. On the left here, I messed it up good time this time. In April of this year, you had a magistrate in St. Lucia, Anne-Marie Smith, attempted assassination on the way to her work at 8 o'clock in the morning. Why? She has been sentencing the drug guys to strong terms of imprisonment, and somebody decided that she needs to go. They haven't found the person as yet. But on the right of this slide is the Prime Minister of St. Lucia making a statement that no one is safe after, in his own constituency office, someone went and assassinated someone. He's meeting his constituents. Someone decides, I don't care if it's the Prime Minister's office, I'm going to kill him. Prime Minister almost got killed in that process. That's the kind of thing that St. Lucia didn't experience before. That's the kind of thing, you know, if there was a Caribbean context in which you expected that to happen, it would have been where? Jamaica. You say, oh, there go them Jamaicans again killing each other. But, you know, one didn't expect that to happen in the Eastern Caribbean. It's now happening in the Eastern Caribbean. But one also, in La Claire, didn't expect that someone would barge into a house 2:30 in the morning and try to assassinate someone who was supposed to give testimony in a drug case, and in the process kill the 8-year-old daughter and wound the 15-year-old daughter to the point where she has to have one arm amputated. No one expected that kind of criminality in the pristine St. Lucia. So the worry is not only about the volume of crime, the worry is about the kinds of crime. This is the little girl who was assassinated. sleeping with her mom and her dad. Her dad was supposed to testify in court. Don't want any testimony? Let's go kill him. He escaped in the kitchen. Child didn't get to go any place. In her bed, shot dead. And so it's the nature of the crime. But there's also been some very interesting, what I call criminal diversification. Gentleman called Jose Figueroa Agosto, reputedly one of the leading organized criminal gangsters in the region, was arrested this year in Dominican Republic. And I was sharing with a friend that I have been quoted before in Time magazine, but I was never quoted in a story where the guy who was a drug trafficker was also a porno king. His diversification was not only drugs, he had a big porno industry. And I'll just have here a couple of sentences from the Time magazine story of August 18. Street vendors in Santo Domingo usually eke out a living selling pirated DVDs of Hollywood blockbusters to motorists caught in the notorious traffic jams of this bustling Caribbean capital. But these days, the motorists are the ones seeking out the vendors. This porno is all the people want, said Wilfredo Ortiz, who was sold DVDs on the streets for 5 years. It's so popular. I've never seen anything like it. This is bigger than Paris Hilton. But the star of the homemade movie that Ortiz is referring to is no American socialite. He's the Dominican Republic most wanted man, Junior Capsula, Angel Rosa, and other names. The kind of criminal enterprise that one didn't have, even in the Dominican Republic. Now, it is not only the increased number of crime, it is the boldness of the crime. This is a case in Puerto Rico this August, where in one weekend, drug gangs led to the killing of 15 people in one weekend. And so the police chief said, along with the governor, they're moving to have tougher responses. Take a guess what you think most of those tougher responses would entail.
I'm sorry.
Take a guess as to what you think some of those tougher responses would entail. Tougher prison sentences. And so as the crime escalates in numbers, as the nature of the crime becomes a little more exotic, the responses generally are, we've got to lock him up for longer periods. We've got to get tough with these people. We've got to put them away. Well, putting them away has implication for imprisonment. Putting them away has implication for penal reform. We'll come to see that in a minute. And you asked the question about a relationship between the nature of the crime and the nature of the punishment. When you see a report in Jamaica, for example, that a guy sentenced for rape, a dastardly criminal act, is sentenced to 52 years. Think of what that means. Even a country like Jamaica that has parole, and we'll come back to talk about parole in a minute. And so the inclination, given the nature of the crime, is to lock them up for longer periods. You rape these people, 52 years imprisonment. That has implications for what happens with the prisons. Because if you have more crimes that are creating outrage where people are saying, not just citizens, but policymakers, lock them up for longer. Lock them up for longer has implications for prison management and prison conditions. Same case in the Bermuda. Royal Gazette is the leading newspaper in Bermuda. The tough responses have been to the point where there has been, for the last decade or more, a groundswell arguing for the death penalty in the Caribbean. Now, the evidence is clear that the death penalty is not a deterrent for crime. But when you've got ordinary quotidian experiences, to use Jorge Dominguez's term, where you have citizens seeing the onslaught, the volume, the violence, they're saying, you got to do something dramatic. And for them, the dramatic is hang 'em. And so you have the Caribbean having the dubious distinction of having the single largest number of countries in any region where the death penalty is part of the response to criminality. Now, there are some countries like Cuba that no longer, although the death penalty is on the books, they don't execute. They have a life term and then they commute the sentence. We can talk a little bit about that. But the death penalty, the point I'm trying to make, the death penalty has been part of the response to the volume and to the outrageous nature of the crime, where, and if you go to the death sentences and executions of 2009, which is an annual report, they list the countries all over the world that have the death penalty still in the books. And they will tell you which countries executed how many in what period. Part of the response to the spiral crime is the argument, irrational given the evidence, the argument that we need to do something, we need to hang them. And sometimes, hang them high. Any Trinidadians in the house? Well, Trinidadians who were following the early 90s drug spree in Trinidad would know the name Dolchady. Trinidad and one of the notorious criminal leaders who was hung, I think, in 1999. This gentleman, Cipriani Batiste, who I met when I was researching a book I'll talk about in a minute, became kind of a popular hero in that he championed tough sentences for not just tough sentences for the Dolchady gang, but he championed the death penalty. Now, he is resurrected his status in Trinidad by now being one of the leading champions of the death penalty in Trinidad, saying that we've got to find a way to put a full range of responses. And he's arguing, Cipriani Batiste argues, that the death penalty ought to be not only on the books, the death penalty ought to be exercised. You've got to hang them. And he has been a proponent of public hangings. Very interesting guy. I'll tell you about him in a minute when I come to this. There are some countries that are still on that death penalty list which have begun to take a different approach. Guyana is one of them. In October of this year, a new legislation that says we are going to forego the death penalty for certain categories of crime. And so they're taking a kind of a dual approach. We're not removing it from the books. We're just not going to exercise it if A, B, C, D, E, F, G categories of crime are there. But what you find interesting is the tough response in the sense of lock them up and lock them up for longer periods is not only there in relation to violent crime. It's there in relation to economic crime in some Caribbean countries. And this is a headline from Grenada, also in the Eastern Caribbean, where Grenada has been having a lot of negative experiences, people paying their economic contributions to the national insurance scheme. No, Social Security equivalent. And so what the government is saying, we've got to send a strong message to these delinquents who are not paying into the scheme because they're wrecking the scheme's ability to take care of the old age, the infirm. And what's the response? Send them to prison. And so the tough measures are not tough measures we're seeing only in relation to violent crime. The tough measures are also beginning to reflect themselves in economic crime. Policymakers are saying, we've got to send a strong message. The strongest message we can send short of hanging them is send them to prison for longer periods. So what we're finding is that a combination of factors, spiraling nature of crime in terms of the volume, the dastardly nature of the crime in terms of crimes not perpetrated or known to be in certain countries before, leading to the call for longer terms of imprisonment, leading to the call for tough sentences. Now, all that is happening in the context of prisons that were already overcrowded in many countries. All that is happening in the context of prisons that are in deplorable conditions in some countries. I wrote a book in 1997 called, oh, that first one, is it left the room yet? Can I have it back? If I don't have it back, I'm not going to pass this one around. I wrote a book in 1997 called Drugs and Security in the Caribbean, Sovereignty Under Siege. And I had some wonderful research opportunities in writing that book. I spent a couple of nights aboard a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, seeing how drug interdiction happens. My wife is scared that I'll be gone and fighting with the bad guys. But I also spent a day in one of the prisons in Trinidad. The Frederick Street Prison. Anybody ever been to the Frederick Street Prison? Don't put your hands up, just say, Well, I went as a guest because I wanted to see, what is the reality of dealing with prisons. The Frederick Street Prison, which is the main prison in Trinidad, was built in the year 1812. It was built when Trinidad was a colony of Britain, and it was built because at the time there was the United States war with Britain, and they built this prison in Trinidad to put some of the prisoners from the United States, from the colonies. That prison was built for just about 500 people. You would not believe the number of people in any one day is in that prison. Actually, I did not spend the entire day. I couldn't spend the entire day. I was flabbergasted what I was seeing. Not just the conditions under which prisoners were having to live, but the condition under which prison officers were having to work. And what is true of many jurisdictions in the United States is also true of many jurisdictions in some Caribbean countries. They are gangs which have their operations in the prisons. And sometimes controlling the gang operations is not an easy thing. Many of the prisons were deplorable then, and this is a Gleaner article going back to 2000, where Calvin Bowe is making a plea. We can't have Jamaicans in prison in such conditions. And in many places, those conditions have not improved. Senator Verna St. Rose Greaves, one of the new senators in Trinidad, in her maiden speech in the parliament this year, was saying, we cannot as a society call ourselves a Trinidadian society and have our prisons in this way. Grown men and women held in cells without sanitary facilities, forced to defecate in the presence of fellow prisoners in buckets, in plastic bags, on paper to be poured into plastic buckets. And we talk about human rights. That's what she said. In the evening, they must stuff their ears and their nostrils. They must put bread in the corner to deflect the cockroaches from crawling into their unguarded orifices. Use your own imagination what those unguarded orifices might be. The point is, what she's saying, deplorable conditions. Deplorable conditions. So part of the need for reform is not only to be able to deal with the numbers of prisoners, part of what precipitates the need for reform is the conditions of prisons are horrible. And they are horrible for the prisoners, and they are horrible for the people who have to work there. It's true in Guyana. True in Jamaica. In April of this year, there was a riot by the prisoners, rioting because they are saying these conditions under which we live are no longer acceptable. Now, it's no consolation to say that the Brazil riots are worse. It's no consolation to say that the riots in Venezuela and Caracas particularly are worse. If you are a prisoner in Jamaica, if you're a decent citizen in Jamaica, you have to be worried about the conditions under which citizens are held in a quote-unquote civilized society. So that's a sense, a small sense, of some of what drives the need for reform. It's driven by nature and volume of crime. It's driven by the connection between crime and punishment, where the punishment is now being extended because the response of citizens and the response of policymakers is such that we've got to do something radical, and do something radical in the sense of either lock them up for longer periods or hang them. But it is also, the reform is also driven by the conditions under which prisoners have to live and the conditions under which prison officers have to live. So let's spend a few minutes, just about 5 or so minutes, working through some of the elements of the second question. What do we need to consider in thinking about penal reform? Well, here again, I think there are three elements to penal reform, and I like to make a distinction between what I call penal reform and penal refresh. Refresh for me is a cosmetic thing, you know, paint up the prison, you give the officers a salary increase, but you don't really change the bases for the reality. I argue that any meaningful effort at penal reform needs to consider at least three factors. Need to consider what are the resources that need to be invested in the reform. Needs to consider what are the legislative and administrative arrangements that also have to be reformed. Again, coming back to my argument earlier, that prisons don't stand as an end in themselves in a silo, they're connected to the broader criminal justice architecture. So you just can't reform the prisons. You've got to do other areas of reform to make the prison reform really efficient and effective. But here's a third, I think, critical aspect of prison reform that needs to be kept in mind. It's got to be civil society engagement. Citizens have got to be outraged and have got to be concerned to the point where they put pressure for appropriate action. And for me, the civil society engagement, this is civil society concern, is not only in relation to the prisoners who are there and those prisoners having to have a modicum of decency as prisoners because they're still citizens or human beings in the society, whether they're citizens or not. The nature of how any society keeps its prison is actually a reflection on the society as a whole. And so one has got to be concerned whether you're a Dominican Republic citizen or Jamaican or Trinidad, that there is something innocuous about your entire society if you can be tolerant about certain kinds of conditions of your people when they're incarcerated for 10 years, 5 years, whatever the period is. But when I write this up, I'm going to spend some time giving a good bit of attention to what I call some of the special factors that make it important that civic engagement be part of the conversation. If you were to do a survey of the demographics of prisoners in any society in the Caribbean, whether Santo Domingo, whether Dominican Republic, whether Haiti, whether Cuba, you'll find a number of realities that are common denominators. Most of those prisoners are between ages 16 and 24. The single largest proportion of those prisoners are young, productive, and they're young, productive males. Think of what a society is doing to itself by not benefiting from the full economic capability of 16 to 24-year-olds. And so I argue that the nature of who constitute the prison population is another reason why civil society has got to not think that it can allow this to happen. But there is also a female dimension to the demographics. There are some societies where significant proportions of the population imprisoned for drug trafficking are women, some of whom innocently think that, you know, in Caribbean, Latin American culture, you're going back from New York to Caracas, Consuelo said, well, take this little package for Manuel in La Ciudad. You don't know what is in the package. That package has something that is an illegal substance. There are thousands of women throughout the Caribbean whose innocence ended up in their being in prison because in their mind, they were doing something for a friend, either taking it from New York or bringing it up from the Caribbean to the United States. But some of them also are being in prison because they're knowingly engaged in it. They take the risk of being paid X amount of dollars and given an airplane ticket and say, your job to make quick bucks, take this to London, take this to Miami, take this to wherever. And so you'll find in many countries, large numbers of the prisoners for drug trafficking related crimes are women. It became a reality for Jamaica about a decade ago. There's a former First Lady of Jamaica called Beverly Manley. And Jamaicans would know Beverly Manley. Beverly used to co-host a radio program called The Breakfast Club. She and Tony Abrams. And I appeared a lot in The Breakfast Club. And one, Beverly called me, I was in Florida then, and said, Ivelaw, I need you to, along with the then Jamaican High Commissioner in London, to talk about the issue of women in prison. And that became an issue for Beverly and Tony because the Jamaican High Commissioner or Ambassador, that time in London, was made to be aware of how many thousands of Jamaican women were in British prisons. They were consciously trafficking, sometimes unconsciously trying to do a favor for a friend, and ended up in prison. So we're going to come back to talk about British prisons in a minute. And so I think partly because of who constitute the prison population, civil society cannot ignore this as a reality of trying to do something about the nature of prisons. Part of how you see prison reform being part on the agenda is the new emphasis being put by an organization called the Association of Caribbean Heads of Corrections and Prison Services. They're trying to streamline what happens, at least within the CARICOM group, not the entire. Dominican Republic is not part of it. Haiti is not part of it. But at least Suriname, along with the English-speaking Caribbean, are part of it. There are several countries, and I named some of them in the first bullet, who've begun to do individual reform efforts, and some of them really are refresh efforts, supported by United States, supported by the Dutch, supported by Britain in some cases. And so the recent episodes in St. Lucia and Jamaica in particular are pushing ACHCPS to try to do something. They signed an MOU early this year to try to do some of that something. Now, part of the response I mentioned earlier to crime is not only punishment through imprisonment. Part of that response is, in some countries, an existence of an imprisonment system along with a parole system. Even in the countries that have a parole system, St. Lucia has a parole system, Jamaica has a parole system, Puerto Rico has a parole system. The parole system is not working efficiently enough to relieve the pressures on the prison population. The parole system is not working efficiently enough to allow for the deplorable conditions to be addressed in any meaningful way. And so, yes, there is parole, but the parole, which is a kind of a mitigating factor on the extent to which imprisonment can be for long term, in most parole systems, you have to serve at least 1/3 of whatever the crime is, the sentence is. There may be extenuating circumstances where you've got to serve 2/3, depending upon the kind of crime. But even in places where there is a parole system, the spiral of the crime has been such, the outrage by the citizens asking for tougher sentences has been such that, yes, there is parole, the prisons are still overcrowded. Yes, there is parole, the deplorable conditions have not really been in a different way. Here is what their show me entails. Every time a judge has to consider exercising the imprisonment option, that judge will be shown what it costs to send the prisoner to prison. Missouri is saying we have to do something about prison in the sense of reforming in keeping the cost down because we broke. Now, there are lots of conversations and several blogs that I follow on this because you can think of what that might mean for influencing the judge to do something in terms of one sentence as opposed to another. But Missouri has said, we need to educate the judges about what the cost is. And so, what's your name?
Daphne.
Daphne, what's your last name?
Decrepin.
Judge Decrepin. Before you sentence, who are you going to sentence? Anybody in here you want to sentence? Not your professors, right? You want to sentence him? What's your name? Olufemi. Olufemi. Is your boyfriend?
No.
Oh, okay. Before you sentence Olufemi, I just need you to know what the cost of sending him to prison for 10 years is going to be. Missouri is saying we need to have our judgment guided by economics. That's an approach. There are pros and there are cons, but that's the approach that Missouri is taking. California has said something slightly different in terms of reform. And it's that relationship between nature of crime and nature of punishment. Proposition 19 did not get support, as you will have followed the news in the last elections. But even before Proposition was shot down, there was a push in California, which the governor supported, that there are certain kinds of infractions for certain kinds of drugs which really don't need to be high misdemeanors. In other words, it should not be a certain kind of crime if you're found with a spliff, to use the Jamaican parlance. And so what California has said, and I thought I had the fine print, what California has said is that we're changing the category of any crime where someone is found with one marijuana cigarette from this category to that category. When it was in this category, it meant that the person was entitled to a defense attorney by the state. When it was in this category, it meant that he had to have a jury trial. When it is in this category, the costs to California were high. Why should we, for a guy with one marijuana cigarette, have such an expense for the state of California? And so they've put it in a different category. They're doing what I call a refresh. But the refresh is saying, we need to think about the entire prison arrangement. We need to think of the prison arrangement in terms of the cost to managing criminal justice enterprise generally. So there are different approaches being tried in different places. There are some countries that have what I call the deportation approach. United States, not simply because of the legislation of 1996, but significantly because of the immigration reform of 1996 has been, as a way of dealing with crowded prisons, and as a way of dealing with the cost of having prison populations of large sizes, they've been sending prisoners back to where they came from. That's a significant issue for many Central American countries. It's a significant issue for many Caribbean countries. As a matter of fact, May 9 of 1997 and May 10 of 1997 were significant years in Caribbean, Central America, in U.S. Central America and U.S. Caribbean relations. It was the first time that a United States sitting president went to Central America to discuss with the presidents in Central America, May 9, and then he went the next day, May 10, to Barbados to discuss with the prime ministers and presidents of the Caribbean in their countries. Top of the list of agenda items in both summits was deportees. The number of people being sent back from the United States to Central American countries, Caribbean countries. But for the United States, and the issue was raised last year when the Attorney General of the United States went to the Caribbean again, the United States says, we are not willing to change the deportation. We've got our own concerns. Yes, we don't want to dump these people back on you, but they're your people. I mean, help me understand, don't you like these? You don't like Jose? Well, he's from your country. Take him back. The deportation approach is the approach that the United States and other countries have been using. And I'll tell you something that makes, when I speak to law enforcement and military folks in the Caribbean, they don't like to hear me say this. It is true that the United States sends back a lot of folks. Canada does as well. Britain does as well. But Caribbean countries also send back folks to other Caribbean countries. Almost every week, you can see someone from the Cayman Islands being sent back to Jamaica. Almost every week, you can see someone from Trinidad, from Guyana, being sent back from Trinidad to Guyana. There is intra-regional deportation, and the reason why Jamaica is doing it, Cayman Islands is doing it, and Trinidad, they're trying to relieve their criminal justice stress. They're saying, these people, these foreign people, yes, they're from the Caribbean, we love them, but we don't love them that much to keep them. Send them back. But the British have been doing it for a long time, but they decided to put a new twist on it. They're putting a twist of money where the mouth is. They're paying every foreign prisoner who voluntarily leaves Britain £1,500 as an incentive. Now, you can imagine what the citizens of Britain are saying. Why are you paying these criminals? The guys committed murder, the guys did whatever. Now you're going to give them money? But the British government figures it's much economically better to them if you pay them £1,500 and let them go. You relieve the stress on the prisons. You relieve the press on the criminal justice architecture. And so the deportation approach, which has been in Britain since the 1970s, has now taken on a new twist as Britain thinks of its own penal reform. And it's thinking of its penal reform in the context of how might I not only reduce the prisons and reform some of the conditions, but how might I do that in a cost-efficient way? So there's a huge conversation now. Nigeria and Jamaica have the dubious distinction of having the first and second single largest numbers of foreign prisoners in Britain. And when 2 weeks ago the British announced that was what they're going to do, Jamaican authorities got very panicked. They asked for a meeting with the British, trying to convince them that they shouldn't do this thing. I don't think the British are going to change their mind, because the British citizens, like the American citizens, are saying, people who are not born here, we need to give them back to their people if they're criminals. And so I've been following the conversation between the British and the Jamaicans as to how to deal with this new twist, and something that's been there for a while, but it's a twist where the British are not saying, may we send them back. They're saying, we will send them back. We will send them back faster if they take the money and go. But one way or the other, we've got to relieve our criminal justice burden. So let me come to my final thoughts and leave some time for a Q&A. I want to return to what Jorge Dominguez said. The most common sources of insecurity in the region affect the quotidian experiences of ordinary people. Those experiences are not only on what happens with the crime perpetrated. Those experiences have to do with what happened to the responses. Because as in every reality, if you're talking about a zero-sum financial pie, a zero-sum game, if you build more prisons, that may be at the expense of what? Government in the sense of what? You may have a choice between building more prisons, and New York has had that choice. Education. You may build more prisons, but something has got to give. What may give is you have less educational opportunities, you have less health care opportunities, you have less roads constructed. One of the things I report in this book, which is a remarkably unremarkable reality. I detail the years when Jamaica's budget allocated more to national security than education and health combined. And so the quotidian experiences are not only what happens with the crime, is what happens to the areas other than crime, because you've got to respond to the crime. You may have to build more prisons. You may have to give the police better salaries. You may have to give the prison officers better salaries. One of the realities that I don't address in this presentation, which I've talked about elsewhere, the reality that in many Caribbean jurisdictions, and not just Caribbean jurisdictions, even though the police and the army are responding, their response is not enough. And so many countries now have lots of private security forces. Private security agencies. And sometimes the government police cannot compete with the private security. The Prime Minister, the Commissioner of Police of St. Lucia was making a threat a couple of months ago. Many of the police officers have another job with the private security. They're calling in sick 3-4 days in a row because they're making extra bucks working with the private security. Now, Jamaica was the first Caribbean country to try to put some regulation. In 1994, they passed a law that established a private security regulation authority. But as I told the colleagues in Dominican Republic a couple of months ago, that has become a revenue source for the Jamaican government, where now they don't mind. Actually, they would love to have more private security companies because it's more annual revenue. And so if you've got to spend more money on your police or prison officers just to compete with the private security forces, you may have less to spend on health care. And so my argument is that it's not only the crime and the security experiences that affect the quotidian realities of people, it's the response. You spend it on police, you may not have it to spend on water supply. You spend it on more prisons, you may not have to spend it on more schools. And so I argue that it is important for us to look at the whole picture, not just what kind of crime is affecting the experiences of people. And I end on a note of sharing with you something that I suspect many of you know. And Dostoevsky wrote several of his books to deal with crime, and he himself had been in prison for a variety of reasons. His experiences and those experiences are reflected powerfully in the two books I list there, but in other works. He talked about the importance of understanding what happens in prisons vis-a-vis what the civilization is all about. And for me, if you take the proposition from Fyodor Dostoevsky that how societies treat their prisoners are a reflection of their view of themselves as a civilization, there is a lot to be said for how the Caribbean is a civilization, or how Caribbean people think of themselves as civilized people, to have the kinds of deplorable conditions and the kinds of extended boundaries and volumes of crime in their prisons. So let me stop there and we'll take questions. Well, Dr. Nath established a protocol of going to the students first, so sorry.
Hello everyone, my name is Provost and I'm an aviation management from New York. I was born and raised in the Dominican Republic and I had the chance to see with my own eyes the crime that is happening in the Dominican Republic and how the police is vulnerable to the different drug dealers that are involved in drugs in the Dominican Republic. You could hear the government talking about secure neighborhoods, in other words, like new projects of increasing the police presence in different neighborhoods, or increasing the salaries of the police forces. But also it's a new project in terms of building new prisons and having the prisons, like the inmates being educated, teach them new skills and stuff. Do you think that this approach, besides investing in education and health, but also investing in the education of the inmates, will decrease the crime rates in the Caribbean countries?
Good question. Short answer, no. But I want to expand a little bit in the context of something that I glossed over earlier. When I talked about the resource investment, I didn't amplify and my 3 Ps that are there. I think part of the investment that need to be kept on the advisement is what do we do by way of people? We need to have, in many jurisdictions, more prison officers, more probation officers. But they need to be trained. The training is very inadequate in many places. My second P is places. In many societies, the facilities are outdated. They need refurbishing. Some places, they need to be new. The prison that was violated in Bordelais is a fairly recently built prison. 2003, I think it was opened in St. Lucia. But notwithstanding the recency, there are lots of flaws. In an effort to cut costs, they took some corners off of the initial design, and they're now beginning to pay with it. But here's my third P. Programs for the prisoners need to be part of the conversation. And that is because the notion of a prisoner, whether it's for 10 years or 15 years, particularly if that prisoner is between the ages 14 to 25, you've got to have a sense that that person will be coming back into the society. And you've got to have an expectation that that person will not be a recidivist. Yes, there is recidivism. What's recidivism? What's recidivism? You're going to get $50 of, where's Howard's? You get $50 of Professor Ruttenberg's money. If anyone can tell us what recidivism is. Right. A repeat offender in and out of prison. You can't assume that all your people who are released from prison will be recidivists. You've got to say, well, let me help them rehabilitate or habilitate so they can go back into society and have alternatives to the criminal enterprise. And that is where the programs for the rehabilitation of the inmates come in. So yes, Jose, I think having those programs, and in many societies they're non-existent. Having those programs are necessary, but I don't think those programs by themselves may lead to a reduction. You've got to have other things in there as well. Now, it is true, I suspect, that as is the case in United States, some United States jurisdictions, there is a certain comfort in going to the prison. But some of those comforts don't exist in the Caribbean. You don't have any guaranteed health care, like the American prison when you go to the general penitentiary in Jamaica. You have no guaranteed square footage of space. I once was in a panel in a place called Utrecht, in the Netherlands. We're doing a global assessment of organized crime, and there was a judge, one of the Netherlands judges, who was taking big pride in how we have to provide certain amount of square footage for our prisoners. And I said, can we send some of our prisoners to you? Because you can provide them the square footage, we can't. There are many people who take a life of crime as recidivists because there's a certain comfort in going back to a place where you have 3 square meals, you have rights to sue. When I was in Florida, they had to adopt a state legislation to limit what prisoners can sue for. People were suing for, one guy was a Rasta, he said reggae music is what he needed, and he sued. And they had to provide him under the state of Florida law attorney. One guy sued because he needed a certain number of rolls. He was a vegetarian, and he needed a certain amount of bread rolls. You don't have those rights in many Caribbean societies. So I don't think that there are other reasons why people may go back to prison repeatedly. But the comfort of having certain guarantees, as happened in some European and American jurisdictions, those comforts don't exist in many Caribbean prisons. So the recidivism for that kind of meal, safety, health, I don't think that exists in the same way.
Now, the question is...
Tell me when we have enough.
Okay. What happened is, when United States or London send those criminals who were born in a certain country and they send them back to their country, did they send it to the custody of the government of that country, or they just send them as a regular citizen?
Good question. Citizens. They send them as citizens, but through the custody of the government. I'll tell you a little part A and part B to that. Part A was they used to just send them. And they used to just send them to the point where some of those who were sent back were now engaging in criminal activities within the Jamaicas and the St. Louis's and the Santo Domingos. And so it became an issue. They met to establish some protocols. There was one outrageous case, it was a Canadian case, where the Canadian government chartered a jet and dumped 800 plus prisoners in Guyana and just took off. They later apologized, but they said, "You're not taking them back. We're sorry." Now, as a result of those pressures, there are now protocols to establish, as a result of that in Jamaica. And you know, Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic has the distinction of having the country with the largest number of deportees. And so now, if you go to the Dominican Republic Embassy in Washington, you will find someone whose job it is to liaise with the Department of Homeland Security to deal with the protocol of, at least tell us what the numbers are, give us the names, give us the criminal record that they have, and just don't dump us. So that's part A and part B. part of the dilemma for all Caribbean countries is that they're obligated to take these citizens back if they are citizens by birth of the country. Yes, many of them have had long, distinguished criminal records in other jurisdictions. But guess what? If they didn't commit a crime in Jamaica, you can't just put them in prison in Jamaica, as many Jamaican citizens were saying. Can you just lock them up when they come from America? Well, there are constitutional protections for them. So many jurisdictions, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and other, even the small islands like St. Lucia that have just a trickle, 12, 14 a year, for them is, how do we manage with this dilemma? Under international law, they've got certain obligations for their citizens of natural birth. And under their own constitutions and criminal justice systems, unless people have committed a crime in their jurisdiction, you really can arrest them, sentence them, things of that kind. So it's been a much contested issue. There were hearings held in September 2007 in Washington just on the deportees issue. Very contested because the United States is saying, we're not stop sending them back. We'll be happy to talk about how we manage it. And it is a dilemma for the countries that are recipient countries. How do we deal with the reality? Jamaica just opened a facility a couple of weeks ago for women deportees who have kids. A lot of women leave their kids making that, I'm just going for a weekend to take a gift, and I'll come back and go to Mobay and take care of the kids. No, when you get caught, you're in prison. The kids, sometimes there is no extended family in your town. And so many of the kids of prisoners, particularly women prisoners, have been in a quandary. There's a nonprofit organization that has established a facility to help women who have been deported. You know, when you're deported, although you haven't committed a crime, there's a stigma against you. Nobody wants to give you a job. Nobody wants to have you to lunch. Surely not at any fancy restaurant where you can be seen going in with them. Can you go through the back and then I'll come meet you? We eat fast and run. So there are a number of dimensions that are creating the complications. Mike?
You know, one of the things that strike me is that this new punitiveness, as criminologists call it, is a punitiveness that is very class-based. It's not toward the elite. It's towards the working class and poverty classes. Somewhat similar to American policy, right? You mentioned that these 16 to 24-year-olds are males and females too, but these are people who haven't had access to good legal services. So we see this as a system of what Zygmunt Bauman calls a way of making people redundant, right? Of not only of giving them a criminal record, so they will be stigmatized. But what happens in these jails, as we know, is a lot of violence and sexual violence. Many of these people are ruined forever, right? And anyway, they're so traumatized they can never come back and really reintegrate into society.
Absolutely.
in any kind of way.
Absolutely.
So anyway, this is kind of a class war, in these societies that are deeply entrenched in class systems, right? This is a way of making sure the working class and the lower class stay in these positions. The second question is the issue of what the U.S. has set up in the Caribbean at Guantanamo, where we have a torture center in there that's operating at this moment, right? Where, according to the Department of Defense's own statistics, only 6% of the people that were tortured had any relation to Al-Qaeda at all. And are we going to see, are we going to see the expansion of U.S.-based prisons in this area?
Well, good questions, observations on both fronts. Let me take the second first. If you asked a question about Guantanamo before 9/11, Guantanamo was slated to be downsized. It really had no geopolitical significance. It lost its geopolitical significance when the Cold War ended. But it assumed a new significance with 9/11. And that new significance, as you rightly said, was intimately connected to America's dilemma of what to do with these people. And that dilemma, in spite of the trials that may start imminently, hopefully not in New York, that dilemma has not really been resolved. And so, I don't see the closure of Guantanamo, and I think we've already begun to see that President Obama has had to backpedal on some of his promises about Guantanamo. But I think you're also likely to see, if you have a resurgence of terrorist acts, even on a scale 10% lesser than 9/11, the question is going to be, where do we put these people? Even if you have to put them violating America's domestic legislation for long periods before trial, the American citizens and American politicians don't want them to come to continental United States. And so the pressure is going to be, where do we put them? So you're likely to see, if that were to be an eventuality of more acts of terrorism, even in smallest cases, the question is going to be, how do we manage the dilemma? We don't want them here, but we want them at a place where we can reach them. Guantanamo is one of those places. Those of us who've been following particularly the last 4 years, would have seen a phenomenon similar to what you were talking about, Mike, and that is and it's particularly in European countries, where do we put some of these people, maybe unknown to the system, as we try to interrogate them, as we try to figure out what to do with them? So I think, yes, to the degree that we have more incidents that create a further dilemma for America to deal with these people, to that extent, Guantanamo is not likely to close, and other jurisdictions may be encouraged to find. There is something called, and I'm blocking on the name right now, places. Ecuador is one, Aruba is one, Curacao is one. Forward operating locations. Forward operating locations. And those are places where the United States Defense Establishment maintain bases that do essentially counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism. Well, conversation started about extending what the forward operating locations might entail. And some of that conversation 2 years ago had precisely to do with contingency planning in case we need to put people elsewhere other than Guantanamo. Might Ecuador be amenable to taking some of them? Might Aruba and Curacao be amenable to taking some of them? So that's the first. And the first question, you're quite right. I am not sure that in every society it's an intended class war, but the outcome is class war in characterization. Because it is those individuals who aren't able to get the legal representation become victims of the system. When I published this book, I had a grant to do a book tour into several Caribbean countries. And I remember in one country, and I would not name the country because you're going to name the person, the Prime Minister heard I was coming, he asked for a meeting. And he was asking my advice on the dilemma he was facing. His dilemma was all the big guys were getting away. They're able to hire the defense attorneys from Miami mostly, or New York, and they could never secure a conviction. And he wanted to amend the legislation to be able to prevent certain kinds of individuals from hiring certain guys. I said, Prime Minister, you're tinkering with some fundamentals of your system which I would not recommend. What he was, in not as many words, talking about is the class correlation. None of the people who were rich and able to afford a defense attorney were ever convicted. The people who were there filling up the prisons were the little guys who, maybe didn't even know they have a right to get the defense attorney, who could certainly not afford any criminal attorney from New York or Miami, and who were always victims of their own circumstance. I'm not saying that what they were doing was justifiable, but they were caught between a rock and many, many hard places. So yes, I don't think that I would agree the proposition is a class warfare by design, but I think in the outcome, it's a correlation between class and crime, a correlation between class and punishment, and what became reality as a conversation about drug trafficking was that you had to extend the perimeters of the conversation about criminality and drugs not only to the people who are trafficking and producing. You had to do something about the people who are money laundering. And very often it was difficult to catch those guys. They hired the best accountants, they hired the best attorneys, they were able to hide their earnings. And if you ask most Caribbean jurisdictions, before the Financial Action Network was established, where Britain and the Netherlands and so on were helping Central American and Caribbean jurisdictions beef up their capabilities to really make the forensic evidence hold in court, the money launderers were getting away. And so they were able to get away partly because they had the wherewithal to hire the best accountants, to hire the best attorneys. They were never sentenced to prison, not because they were not guilty. It's just that under the rules of the game, you couldn't find them guilty.
Related to Mike's question, just on punitiveness related to sort of class comments, it seems like Cuba comes out as a bright spot, at least in not having the death penalty and some prison conditions. Is it also a bright spot in terms of crime statistics? And if so, what do you think contributes to its bright spot status in the Caribbean?
Cuba has been a bright spot, if you want to use those terms, but I think a bright spot for some of the wrong reasons. The reason why there was low crime is because the authoritarian system came down on you heavily for any crime. So the nature of the system provided its deterrent. The reason why there was significant minimal criminality, does the word Mariel resonate with anyone? Yes. Mariel? Mariel is a place in Cuba from which notoriously in 1980, Fidel Castro called Jimmy Carter's bluff. And Jimmy Carter said, well, send him if you like. What was Fidel say, you want them, Let's go to the prisons and get some of them. Let's go to the asylum and get some of them. So that Mariel influx of 80, 81, 82 was a significant release for the Cuban system because they sent a lot of their prisoners out, and some of them for years were locked up because they came right to the United States and started committing crimes. And so they had open special prisons for them in Texas, in Louisiana. The system and the dynamics of United States-Cuban relations has provided some relief valve. Now, criminality in Cuba has begun to be in the upswing as the system relaxes and adapts. It is now permitted to have your private restaurants. It is now permitted to have small businesses. Tourism has been in an upswing. As a matter of fact, Fidel made an interesting report in 1991 where for the first time in 1990, tourism revenues surpassed sugar in Cuba. And so the tourism industry has allowed for all sorts of not so nice stuff to happen. So in the last few years, their criminal enterprise linked to tourism, linked to drugs, and yes, they have a drug problem. They will tell you they have a drug problem. They cooperate with the United States. So there are many dynamics about the authoritarian nature of Cuba that has explained a certain, what appears to be bright spot, but the dynamics, Mariel, was a significant release of prisoners and of lunatics. And Fidel, one of the things that Jimmy Carter said that he regretted is having just, I'll take them. We are the big democracy. Fidel sent people who are little Cuban criminals, little Cuban lunatics. Sí, señor, ándale. The death penalty has been suspended, and the suspension of the death penalty in execution has been because of pressures from the European Union to try to put a more human face on what Cuba does. If you follow Cuban relations in the last year, some very dramatic things have been done in the last year. Working with the church to release prisoners. Raul Castro, a month ago, went to a mass in the cathedral. So there's some changed realities, and those realities are going to be politically good on one hand, but they're also beginning to reveal political problematics and criminal problematics. And there's some of the guys who are coming for the tourism, they're also coming to buy drugs. They're coming to buy women.
Provost, I'm going to ask that we, due to the interest of time, just end on this note, and
Okay.
then those of you who would like to continue the conversation, he'll be here for a few minutes after the talk, and maybe we can just thank him for the conversation.
Before you go, I'd love to have that book back. Thank you very much, Robert.
Let's thank the Provost one more time.